morning, Temple Baptist Church. Happy to see you this morning. This morning we'll be reading from Matthew, chapter 8, verses 18 through 22. Relatively short passage that's full of good stuff here. When the cost of following Jesus is the title in the NIV version. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." Bury their own dead. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, if you're new to our church, we are working our way through the Gospel of Matthew, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And we come to a section today where we see in verses 18 through 22, the true urgency of life is to follow Christ. Jesus' teaching has been outstanding. He has drawn crowds around him because he teaches not as the scribes and the Pharisees, but as one who has authority, the Scripture says. But when he started doing miracles and casting out demons, that's when people came in droves. And Matthew shows us here that not everyone who was drawn to Jesus is ready to make the necessary sacrifices to follow Jesus. And so the two men in this story illustrate this very well. So we're going to look this morning, in the brief time that we have, we're going to look at two potential disciples. Two potential disciples. I say potential because they both come up short with Jesus, and it's not clear how either man responded to Jesus' invitation here. So did they ultimately follow him, or did they walk away? Interestingly, Matthew does not tell us, but there's no confusion about Jesus' expectations here for being a disciple. His demands are high, and they are without apology and without exception. So, if we were going to summarize this passage maybe in one sentence, what we see here this morning, it would simply be this: there is no such thing as being a part-time disciple of Jesus. There is no such thing as being a part-time disciple of Jesus. So looking at our text, Matthew tells us here in verse 18 that there's a crowd that has gathered around as a result. And Jesus, you'll notice here, he gives instructions, go over to the other side. In other words, to the eastern side of the lake being Lake Tiberias, or as it's sometimes called, the Sea of Galilee. So they're going to head to the other side of the lake. Now, Matthew doesn't tell us the reason for this. Maybe Jesus was tired. Maybe he just had been working with the crowds and ministering. He just needed a little downtime. It's possible that he just wants to get away and have some teaching time with his disciples. So there are many people in this crowd that like Jesus. They are attracted to him for a variety of reasons. But when the rubber meets the road, they're not willing to commit to following him. So Matthew here uses these two potential would-be disciples to illustrate this fact. So let's look at the first one very briefly this morning. The first potential disciple is what I call the hasty disciple. The hasty disciple. Look at verse 19 again. It says, "And a scribe came up and said to him, 'Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go.'" So the scribe here is an expert in the law, in oral tradition, in the actual written law. Usually, if you think about in the Gospels, these guys get a lot of criticism from Jesus. But that's not the case here. There's a few rare exceptions where Jesus does not criticize such folks. And he addresses Jesus here as teacher. Teacher. Now, this title, let me just kind of make a little, throw out a little detail here. It's interesting because this title is used in all the Gospels, but only in Matthew's Gospel does this title, teacher, only is it used by people who are not fully convinced of who Jesus is. All right, so when you read Matthew's Gospel and somebody uses the word teacher for Jesus, they're not really on board. They're not fully convinced of who Jesus is. They're not yet a follower. So he uses this title teacher here for Jesus. Now, you might say, well, isn't that true? And yeah, it is. In one sense, it's accurate. Jesus is a teacher. The problem is that it's incomplete, or it's not adequate. Let me make an analogy. If you were addressing a president of the United States and you referred to, let's say, a president as our esteemed leader, would that be true? Absolutely, it would be true. But it's not really adequate, is it? Because the president is not just an esteemed leader, he is the president. So this scribe, he's clearly impressed with Jesus. He sees him as teacher. He states that he's going to follow Jesus. In Jewish practice, here's what happened. If you wanted to be a disciple, you chose your rabbi. That's how it was in the culture. You chose the rabbi. So it might be that what this guy's saying to Jesus is, hey, I have chosen you as my rabbi. You should be honored. I'm going to follow you. And when he says here, I will follow you, he probably just means I want to get in the boat and go with you to the other side of the lake, continue to listen to your teachings. I don't think he meant, absolutely, unequivocally, I will follow you in every way. Now, I'll tell you why I don't believe that. The Gospels tell us that Jesus knew what was in the heart of man. He knew what was in the heart of man. Sometimes he revealed things to people and they were like, their mind was blown. How in the world did he know this? And so Jesus, as he hears this man say, I will follow you, Jesus realizes he has not really considered the cost, not really considered the demands of being his disciple. So in verse 20, he says to him, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Creatures of the ground and the air, they've got a place to sleep at night, but I can't guarantee you shelter if you come with me. Right? I'm not staying at the Marriott. I have an itinerant preaching ministry. Now, Jesus probably did have a house back in Capernaum, but while he's out on the road ministering, he's moving from location to location without any certainty for good accommodations. And interestingly here, you'll notice that he, as I mentioned a moment ago, he refers to Jesus as teacher. But when Jesus refers to himself, he refers to himself as Son of Man. Son of Man. You'll see that title a lot in the Gospels. I think it's something like 80 sometimes Jesus refers to himself as Son of Man. It's his favorite designation, his favorite self-designation. Now, what does that mean, Son of Man? Well, it speaks of his humanity. It speaks of his humility. But probably greatest of all, it speaks to his divinity. It actually comes from the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Daniel interprets a dream, and he sees this divine being described as a son of man coming in the clouds with great glory. Jesus, by using this title, he's self-identifying. I'm that person. In fact, let me share a reference with you from Mark's gospel. You remember when Jesus is on trial? He's before the Sanhedrin, which is the high priest, or the high court, the supreme court, if you would, of the high priest and all the top priests in Israel. Here's what the high priest asked him. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus. And listen to what he says next. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now listen to what happens next. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses, he asked. You have heard this blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him worthy of death. So this man has seen Jesus teach and preach. Right? He's witnessed his compassion, and he's moved. He's watched Jesus heal and deliver, and he's in awe. He sees Jesus to a point. He's a teacher, but he doesn't quite see him as Son of Man. And it all looks amazing to him. And he's eager to get in the boat and take a ride with Jesus. And such is the response of would-be hasty disciples. You see, potential disciples are attracted to perceived glory. They're, hanging out with Jesus, man, that looks good. That makes me feel good. Then there's the thought of what Jesus is doing in the moment, miracles, his teaching, how it moves you, all of it. He's caught up in it. But Jesus challenges this potential disciple into considering the cost. It's not easy. So he says to him, have you counted the cost? So that's potential disciple number one, the hasty disciple. Let's look at number two, the half-hearted disciple. So if Jesus' response to this first man sounded a bit rough to our ears, well, this one's going to be a lot more shocking. Verse 21, and another of the disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, follow me and leave the dead to bury the dead. And you thought your boss was mean because he wouldn't give you off Friday so you could have a long weekend. Jesus' response to this man admittedly sounds harsh, but not really when you look at it upon closer examination. In Jewish culture, if your mother or your father died, you had a sacred responsibility to oversee that funeral process. In fact, even a priest, priests were not to come in contact with a body. There was a special exemption. If you had your father or your mother die, you could actually go home and take care of them. So this is a pretty big deal. And so since the law taught that you have to honor your parents, your burial duties, they were sacred responsibilities. Funerals usually happen on the day of your death, so you better make sure you're really dead. And then, that's a joke, right? And there's usually a longer period of mourning attached to the funeral. Now, this man says to Jesus, let me go and bury my father. Now, does that mean that his father died? Or does that mean that his father's health is declining and he'll probably die at some point in the future? Well, again, Matthew doesn't explicitly tell us, but given what the Old Testament taught about honoring your parents and the expectation just in general of Jewish culture, how you took care of your parents, it's unlikely that this man's father had died. It's unlikely that he'd already died. An Orthodox Jewish son would not be listening to an itinerant preacher while his father just died at home. It just wouldn't happen. He'd be home, if his father actually had died, he'd be home taking care of all those burial responsibilities. What's more likely is that this man's father is not yet dead, but his health is failing. In fact, that phrase, to bury one's father, it's a cultural idiom for staying home and taking care of your parents as long as they lived. So this man is, in effect, saying, someday, after my parents have died, I will follow you. In other words, I want to be your disciple, but just not today. Not right now. The timing is inconvenient for me. And again, Jesus sees this man, he's not ready. He's just not ready to be his disciple, so he challenges him to fully get on board. He says to him in verse 22, follow me and leave the dead to bury their dead. Now, there's a bit of debate about what Jesus meant by this phrase. Some scholars say that it's an Aramaic proverb that basically says, leave your old life behind. Others say that Jesus was saying to this man, look, there are some things that other people can do, so you let the spiritually dead go and bury the physically dead. And still others say that Jesus was intentionally shocking here, that his point was that even the greatest of obligations should not keep you from following me. Personally, I think that's what Jesus was saying. He was challenging this man to say, let nothing keep you from being my disciple. And so like the first man, Jesus invited this man and to be his disciple, and he explained to him the demands of discipleship. Did he walk away? We don't know. We don't know the end of either man's stories. But let me ask you a question this morning. What about yours? What do you say to Christ? As we look at these two examples, we see what really separates the crowd from the committed. We see the difference between casual Christianity, which, newsflash, is not really Christianity, and being a fully devoted follower of Christ. I think if there's one application that you could take home from this passage, it would simply be this, that Jesus urges us to count the cost in being his disciple. I mean, I don't know about you, but the more I have read this passage, the more I've thought about it, it's disturbing. It's a bit unnerving. It makes me wonder, am I really a disciple? And it should hit you the same way this morning. Jesus urges us to count the cost to be his disciple. These two men, they're initially enthusiastic, they're eager about Jesus, but they've not considered the demands of discipleship. And both of them are not accepted by Jesus as disciples until they count the cost, until they go all in on their commitment. You know, so many people think that they get to heaven just by mere faith. But James, the book of James says faith without your works is dead. Unless we show that we live our lives, unless we show that in our lives we live for Christ, we're not really his disciples. Now, to be sure, we are saved by grace apart from our works, But our works are necessary proof that we actually have faith. And so this event, you look at it, Matthew's gospel, it happened 2,000 years ago, and yet it feels very contemporary. Many people in the crowd admired Jesus. They wanted him to do something for them, give him a healing, inspire me with your teaching. I want to sit back. I want to see you do one of those exorcisms or those miracles. But here's the deal. They didn't really want Jesus. And that's still true today. Many people want the benefits of heaven without God. Give me paradise with all its perks, but let me be. Many people want the blessings of God without any obligations to Him or anyone else. For example, I don't know if you keep up with this sort of thing, but every once in a while we come out with new lingo to describe something in our culture, and so it's very hip today to say that you're spiritual versus religious. People talk about I'm given to spirituality. And when you press them on the meaning of what does it mean to be spiritual versus religious, what you find is, honestly, it's just repackaged paganism for a 21st century audience. It's a self-styled sort of spirituality that conforms to their own inclinations, their own desires, and it has no personal obligation to Christ or to a larger community of faith. So church and its structure and its rigidity, it's too much for them. And the church, those church people, they're prudish, they're moralizing, and doctrine, well, that's just way too restrictive. I like to think for myself. I don't just think and do what other people say. Spirituality speaks in vague terms about something greater, a higher power, the universe watching over me, the universe hopefully rewarding me. And so with spirituality, here's what you can do. You can feel spiritual, and you can believe that you're somehow connected to the divine, whatever that is, without having any obligations to God or anybody else. But you'll notice in the story that out of the crowd here, Jesus calls disciples. He commands them, get in the boat. They had personal obligations to Him, to each other, and to the world around them. And that's still true today. There are, in some ways, I think these men, they come off as more sincere than many people in the church today. Think how little people are willing to commit to today. And yet, Jesus still sent them away. So my question to you is, how have you answered Jesus' call to be a disciple? You have enthusiasm. That's great. You should have that. Don't lose it. But are you committed to following Him for the rest of your life? Are you serious about bringing your life under His authority and under the authority of His Word? Or are you the kind of person that just says, you know what, I just want to make it up as I go along and do whatever feels right to me? Or maybe you're like the second man here in the passage. You've got excuses for the lack of fully surrendering to follow Christ. As a pastor, I've heard many of these over the years. I want to follow Jesus, but I still want to go out and, do all the crazy stuff I've always done. I want to follow Jesus, but I'm not going to be sexually chaste until marriage. I want to be able to do what I want with my body. I'll serve in some capacity, maybe a deacon, a team leader, a teacher, but I'll do it later in life, after I've, retired from work. I remember years ago in a church I served, we had a tremendous need in the church for a leader in a particular area. We had a man in the church who was truly gifted and was just right for the job. And I said, would you do this? And his answer was, no, not now. He's like, I'll do it when I retire. Well, let me just tell you, he's retired, and you know what he's not doing? Take a guess. My flesh comes first. My greed comes first. My spouse, my parents, my girlfriend, my boyfriend comes first. Playing sports comes first. I want to follow Jesus, but the world is filled with people who postpone their allegiance to Christ for all sorts of excuses, all sorts of reasons. Jesus does not beg us to be His disciples, but He does call us. And that call is genuine, and it's rooted in love for you and me. So, in closing this morning, let me just simply ask you, who or what is holding you back? What excuses have you been giving to the Lord? What kind of delays are you saying to God this morning in your life? Lord, I will do this, but not now. Will you finally answer the call this morning in your life? So what is it that's holding you back? Is it fear? Is it your love for this world? Is it your pride? I don't want to be identified with those people. Is it accountability? I just want to be in charge and do everything my way? Who or what is holding you back?